Hello there and welcome. I am so glad you decided to settle in tonight. Find a cozy spot, let your shoulders soften, and let the lights go low. I have a small handful of quiet stories for you, the kind of stories that wander gently and ask nothing of you at all. There is no hurry in any of them. Let your breath slow down with mine, and let the words carry you off whenever you are ready. If you drift away before the end, that is the whole point. The first story I want to share is about a long, slow train ride I took through the hills one autumn, when I was a little younger and not quite as tired as I am now. I had been visiting a friend in a small inland town for a week, and when it came time to go home, I decided to take the night train instead of the day one. The day train was faster, but the night train followed the old route along the river and through 3 mountain passes, and I had always wanted to ride it just once. My friend drove me to the little station on the edge of town just before sunset, and we stood on the platform together for a few minutes without saying much. There was a soft, warm wind coming off the fields behind us, and you could smell cut hay in it, and the dust of late summer settling down for the year. The station itself was an old brick building with a sloped tile roof, and the lamps along the platform had just begun to glow that pale yellow color they only get at dusk. When the train pulled in, it did so very slowly and almost without sound. It was an old train, with painted green carriages and brass railings along the steps, and the windows were tall and slightly rounded at the top. A conductor leaned out of the second carriage and waved me on with a friendly hand. I hugged my friend, picked up my one small bag, and stepped up into the corridor. The corridor smelled of old polished wood and a little bit of tea, and I could hear someone laughing softly 2 doors down. The compartment I had booked was at the back of the second carriage. It was a small room with 2 narrow bunks, a folding table, a brass reading lamp with a green glass shade, and a long window that ran almost the whole length of the wall. The seats were upholstered in a soft red wool that had faded over many years into something closer to rose. I sat down by the window, set my bag at my feet, and let myself look out as the platform began to slide gently backward. The train moved so slowly out of town that for a long time it felt as if the houses were the ones leaving, and not me. I watched the warm windows of the last few cottages drift past, and a woman hanging up a tea towel on a back porch, and a black dog watching the train go by from the top step of a garden shed. Then the houses fell away and there were only fields, and the fields were all soft gold and rust in the last of the light, and the hills beyond them were already going blue. After a while there was a knock at the door, and a young steward leaned in with a tray. He had a small pot of tea, a cup, a little jug of milk, 2 thin biscuits, and a folded card with the schedule on it. He told me the dining car would be open for another hour if I wanted a real meal, but I told him I had eaten in town. He smiled, set the tray down on the folding table, and slipped back out without a fuss. I poured myself a cup of tea, added a slow splash of milk, and held the cup with both hands. The train picked up a little speed as it moved into the open country, but it was still a gentle speed. You could feel the carriage rocking very softly side to side, and you could hear the wheels saying something steady and friendly underneath. It was not a loud sound at all. It was more like a heartbeat, or like the sound of someone breathing in another room. I watched the river appear and disappear out the window as the track wound along its bank. It was a wide, slow river, the kind that turned silver at dusk and then very black, and there were small wooden bridges across it here and there, and once in a while a single lamp on a far shore. A heron stood in the shallows near one bend with its long neck folded up like a question mark. As we went past, it did not move, and I thought how nice it must be to stand so still in one place that even a passing train does not really matter to you. After the tea, I felt warm and a little sleepy, but I was not ready to lie down yet, so I went out into the corridor and walked the length of the carriage. There were not many other passengers. An older couple sat in the lounge car at the front, sharing a slice of cake and looking out the windows together without saying much. A boy of about 10 was reading a paperback book on the floor by the corridor window with his coat folded under him as a cushion. He looked up at me as I passed, and we exchanged a small nod, the kind of nod you give a stranger on a long, quiet train when you both know there is no hurry. I went all the way to the end of the carriage and stood for a moment at the door between cars, where the floor moved a little more under your feet, and I watched the dark country roll by. Before I went back to the compartment, I stopped for a few minutes in the lounge car. The older couple were still there, sharing the last of their cake, and they smiled at me as I came in. There was a small round table in the corner with a window beside it, and I sat there for a while with my hands folded in my lap and let the country pass by in the dark. The lounge had a low ceiling and warm wooden walls and one old radio set on a shelf at the front, playing some soft string music so quietly that you had to lean in to hear it properly. The woman at the next table told me, in a quiet, kind voice, that they had been riding this train on the same week every year for almost 20 years. Her husband nodded without looking up from the window. I told her I thought that was a beautiful sort of habit, and she patted the back of my hand once, very briefly, and went on with her tea. I stayed in the lounge a few minutes longer, watching the lights of one far farmhouse cross the window, and then I said goodnight and went back to my compartment. Back inside, I changed into my night clothes, brushed my teeth at the little folding sink, and lay down on the lower bunk. There was a soft brown blanket folded at the foot of it, and a small white pillow that smelled faintly of soap. I left the reading lamp on, but turned it as low as it would go, so the room was full of a quiet green glow that did not hurt my eyes. I had brought a book with me, an old novel about a country doctor who liked to take long walks, but I only read a few pages before I noticed I was reading the same line over and over and not really following it. I put the book face down on the table and let it stay there. The train slowed for a small village station around midnight, and from my bunk I could see the platform lights swing slowly past the window. A single person was waiting at the far end with a small suitcase. They stepped up into the train, and a moment later I could hear footsteps move along the corridor and a door open and close somewhere down the line. Then the train started again, very gently, and the village slipped away into the dark. For a few minutes after the village, the train moved through a long stretch of low farmland. The fields outside the window were silvered by moonlight, and I could see the rounded shapes of haystacks in the pastures and the dark patches of small ponds reflecting the sky. A barn owl drifted across one of the fields on slow wings and was gone again in a heartbeat. A single porch light shone on the side of a farmhouse, and a dog stood under it watching the train go by, very calmly, as if he were used to it. After the village and the long, quiet fields, we entered the first mountain pass. The track climbed in long, lazy curves, and the windows filled up with rock walls and then dropped open again onto wide black valleys with far little lights at the bottom. The carriage tilted just a little on the curves, in the way a cradle tilts. I lay on my side and watched the slow shapes outside. I thought about my friend and the dinner we had cooked together 2 nights before, and the way her cat had sat on the windowsill and watched the steam rise off the pot. Somewhere in the middle of the first pass, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is opening my eyes in a different kind of darkness, and the train had stopped at a small mountain halt. I could hear a soft conversation outside on the platform, and a low laugh, and the click of a door closing further down the train. There was a thin smell of pine in the air that had not been there before. I lifted my head just enough to see out the window. A single bench sat under a single lamp on a little wooden platform, and beyond it, a wall of dark trees rose up into a sky full of clear, calm stars. I lay back down and the train began to move again, and the wheels picked up their gentle, even sound. Somewhere a kettle had been put on in the staff car, and a faint, warm smell of tea drifted along the corridor and reached my door. I pulled the blanket a little higher and let my eyes close. A while later, we crossed a long, tall bridge over what I think must have been a lake, because there was a wide patch of moonlight below us and no other shape at all. The track made a slow, soft humming sound on the bridge, a little different from the sound it made on regular rail, and the carriage seemed to float for a few seconds in the air. I opened my eyes just long enough to see one little fishing boat anchored out on the water with a single warm lamp burning at the bow. There was no one moving on the boat that I could see. It just sat there in the moonlight as we slid by overhead. Some time after that, we entered the second mountain pass. This one was quieter than the first, with fewer curves and longer straight runs through deep forest. I did not see much of it because I was mostly asleep, but I remember a single deer standing at the edge of a clearing as we went past, looking up at the train with calm, dark eyes. I remember thinking, in that half-awake way you think when you are warm and safe, that this was a kind of luck I would not have known to ask for. The rest of the night came and went in soft pieces. I would surface for a few minutes, see a flicker of moonlight on water, or feel the train sway around a long bend, and then I would slip back under again. At one point, I heard the boy from earlier walking down the corridor, very quietly, with his book under his arm and his slippers on. At another point, I heard the steward laugh softly in the dining car and the clink of a cup being set down. None of these sounds were sharp. When I woke up properly, it was just before dawn. The train was running along a wide valley I did not recognize, and the sky was beginning to turn pale blue at the bottom and pink along one edge of a long, thin cloud. The river was beside us again, and there were a few small farms along its banks, and a man in a tan coat was walking out to a barn with two dogs trotting ahead of him. I lay still for a long time and watched the day come up. I sat up slowly, folded the blanket, and washed my face. The steward came by with a tray of breakfast, a small pot of fresh tea, a hard roll, a little bowl of stewed fruit, and a folded napkin. I ate by the window, watching a long line of low hills go by, and I felt the kind of quiet rest in my body that you only feel after a night spent moving gently through the dark. The train arrived at my home station an hour after sunrise. The light was very soft and very golden, the way it can only be on an autumn morning at the end of a long, slow journey. I picked up my bag, thanked the steward at the door, and stepped down onto the platform. The air smelled of bakery bread from the cafe across the road, and somewhere a sparrow was making a small, steady song in a hedge. I walked home along the quiet streets with my bag over one shoulder. The whole journey already felt a little dreamlike behind me, and I knew I would remember the sound of those wheels and the green of that lamp for a long time. I unlocked my front door, set down my bag, watered the plant on the windowsill, and put the kettle on for one more cup of tea. Then I sat in the chair by the window, watched the morning settle in over the rooftops, and let the day begin very softly in its own quiet time. The next story is about a rainy afternoon at a small bookshop in a quiet town by the river, where for a long time I was lucky enough to be the person behind the counter. The shop sat on a narrow street that bent down toward the water, and it had a green wooden door with a brass bell over the top of it. The bell had a very particular sound, soft and round, more like a small clearing of the throat than a real ring. If you were sitting in the back of the shop and the bell went, you knew at once that someone had come in, but you did not feel startled. You felt the way you feel when an old friend taps once on the window before they come inside. The day I want to tell you about began with a sky the color of pale gray paper. I had walked to the shop from my flat 3 streets over, with my coat collar turned up and a small umbrella under one arm. The river was running quietly, and the trees along the embankment were full of new wet leaves, and the cobblestones along my street still had a thin shine from the rain that had fallen overnight. I unlocked the green door, hung up my coat on the peg behind the counter, and put the kettle on. The shop was an old shop. The shelves went all the way up to the ceiling on 3 of the 4 walls, and the 4th wall was the front window. The shelves were made of dark wood that had grown a little darker over the years, and they were full of books of every kind, in every direction, packed in tightly and standing in soft leaning rows. There was a small ladder on rails that you could slide along to reach the top shelves. There was a low, round table in the middle of the room with a vase of dried flowers on it. And in the back corner, there were two old armchairs by a small fireplace, and a worn rug on the floor between them, and a low brass lamp on a little side table. That morning was very slow. The rain came on again at about 9:30, gentle at first, then a little steadier. I could hear it on the front window and on the roof above the back room, and through the open door of the shop kitchen, I could hear it dripping from the gutter at the back. The sound it made was the comfortable kind, like a soft pat on the shoulder over and over again. I made my tea, settled into the chair behind the counter, and began the slow work of catching up on things. I had a small stack of new arrivals to enter into the ledger, and a box of second-hand books a woman had brought in the week before, and a few orders waiting to be wrapped for collection. I worked at all of this without hurry, the way you can work on a rainy morning when you know nobody is in a rush to find you. The little brass bell over the door stayed quiet for a long time, and that was fine with me. After a while, the rain settled into a steady, soft fall, and the light in the shop went a soft silver color, the way it does when the sky outside is a flat, low cloud. I turned on the lamp by the window, and then the brass lamp in the back corner, and the shop filled with a warm yellow glow that mixed nicely with the silver light from outside. I have always liked that mix of lights on a rainy day. It feels like the shop is its own small island, holding its own little weather, while the bigger weather just passes by the windows. Around 11, the bell over the door cleared its throat, and a small, older woman in a green raincoat came in, folding a clear umbrella as she stepped onto the mat. I knew her. She lived 2 doors down from the shop, and she came in once or twice a week, mostly to browse and to talk for a few minutes, and sometimes to buy a thin paperback mystery from the table by the window. We greeted each other, and she asked about my mother, who had been a little unwell, and I told her my mother was much better and was already complaining about the weather, which we both took as a good sign. The older woman laughed softly at that, and she went to the table of new mysteries and began to look through them with her glasses pushed up on her forehead. I made her a cup of tea without being asked, because she always took one, and I set it down on the little side table near her without saying anything, because she did not need me to. She nodded once to thank me and went on looking through the books. The rain kept falling. The kettle ticked as it cooled. A little later, a young man came in with a sleeping baby strapped to his chest in a soft cloth carrier. He took off his hood very carefully so as not to wake the baby, and he came up to the counter and asked, in a half-whisper, whether I had any picture books about small boats. I told him I did, and I led him gently to the back wall where the children's books lived, and I pulled 3 down for him to look at. He sat on the rug there with the baby still sleeping on his chest, and he turned the pages of each one very softly, and he chose the one with the pictures of a small red tugboat in a calm harbor. He paid in coins, he counted out one at a time on the counter, and he left as quietly as he had come. The bell cleared its throat one more time before noon, and an older man I had known for many years came in. He was a regular too, a retired schoolteacher who liked history books and slow conversations. He brought in a brown paper bag with 2 warm pastries from the bakery on the corner, and he set the bag on the counter and said with a small smile that he had bought 2 because he thought I might be working alone today. We sat together for nearly an hour at the round table by the window with our tea and our pastries, and he told me about a long article he had been reading about old railway stations, and I told him about a book that had come in the day before about the history of bridges along the river. We did not always agree on which was more interesting, but we agreed on the rain, and on the pastries, and on how nice it was to be inside. After he left, I sat for a while at the counter and watched the street through the front window. The rain had eased into a fine mist, and the cobblestones were dark and shining, and the trees along the embankment had the deep green color trees only get when they have been drinking all morning. A woman walked past with a small white dog on a red leash. The dog was wearing a tiny yellow raincoat, which made me laugh out loud in the empty shop. The woman saw me through the window and laughed too, and the two of us shared a small silent joke that neither of us had to explain. I decided after that to redo the front window display. It had been the same for almost a month, and I felt like giving the street something new to look at. I took out the old display, which had been a small group of summer cookery books, and I sat for a while on the floor of the shop thinking about what to put in. After a few minutes, I decided to do a window of slow books, the kind you read very slowly because you do not want them to end. I picked out a small worn novel about a country village, a thin book of nature essays, a slim travel diary about a walking trip across a quiet country, and a soft hardback collection of poems about rivers. I built a little gentle scene in the window with these 4 books, leaning 2 of them against a brown ceramic jug and laying a folded gray scarf along the front to soften the line. I added a sprig of dried lavender from the vase on the round table and a single white candle in a small glass holder. The whole window had the look of a quiet evening in someone's reading corner. I stepped outside under the awning, in the soft mist, and looked at it from the street. I was pleased with it. I came back inside and dusted my hands on my apron. The afternoon went on the way the morning had, only a little dimmer. The light from outside softened until it was almost evening, even though it was only just past 3. I made another pot of tea and ate the second half of my pastry from the brown paper bag. I read a few pages of the book I kept under the counter, an old novel I had read 3 times already that I sometimes just opened to a familiar page to keep me company. A small spider walked along the front of the counter, and I let it pass, because I have always liked to share the shop with small living things. Around 3:30, I went into the back room for a few minutes to check on a small repair I had been putting off. There was an old leather chair back there with a stitched seam that had begun to come loose, and a basket of well-loved hardbacks waiting for new paper covers. I sat on the floor by the basket with a roll of brown paper and a pair of scissors, and I wrapped 2 of the books while the rain pattered softly on the back window. There is something very peaceful about wrapping a book in plain paper. You smooth the corners with the side of your hand, you fold the edges in cleanly, and you secure them with a small piece of tape. When you are done, the book sits quietly in your lap, ready for its next reader, looking like a small gift to someone who has not yet been chosen. I made a tidy little stack of the new covered books on the floor beside me, and then I stood up slowly and went back to the front of the shop. Just before 4, the bell cleared its throat again, and a quiet woman in a navy coat came in. She was new to me. She walked slowly along the shelves, with her hands held very softly in front of her, and she took down 1 or 2 books to look at the covers and put them back carefully. After a while, she came up to the counter and asked, in a low voice, whether I had any books about gardens. I led her to the gardening shelf, and we looked together for some time. She told me she had just moved into a small cottage outside town and inherited an old garden, and she did not know where to start. I helped her choose 2 books, one practical and one slow, and I put a small bookmark with the shop name in the front of each, and I wrapped them in brown paper with a single length of string. She thanked me and went out into the soft evening, and the bell cleared its throat one more time, and the door clicked shut. After she was gone, I locked the door and turned the sign on the inside of it from open to closed. The street outside was lamplit by then, and the cobblestones shone yellow under the street lamps. I tidied the round table and washed the cups in the small sink in the back, and I swept a small soft drift of dust from under the children's shelf. I checked the till and put the day's small earnings in the velvet bag I always kept in the drawer. Before I left, I stood for a long moment at the round table in the middle of the shop, with my coat over my arm, and I let myself just listen to the quiet of the place. The kettle was warm but no longer hissing. The little brass lamp at the back was glowing softly over the empty armchairs. The rain had stopped completely, and the silence outside was the soft kind, full of small, wet drips from the awning. The shop felt the way a shop should feel at the end of a day like that, like an old friend who had had a peaceful visit. I turned off the lamps, one by one. I shrugged into my coat and opened the green door. The little bell cleared its throat one last time as I stepped out, and I locked the door behind me, and I walked slowly home along the wet street, with the cool evening air on my face and the smell of rain on the cobblestones, and a quiet, warm feeling in my chest that I have never quite been able to find anywhere else, but in that little shop, on a long, slow, rainy afternoon. The next story is one I have been carrying for a long time. It is about the summer my granddaughter came to stay with me when she was 8, and we spent most of our days in the garden behind the house. I had been living alone in the old place for some years by then. It was a small white house at the end of a long, quiet lane, with a low picket fence in front and a much wider yard at the back than the front would have you guess. The back garden ran from a flagstone patio at the kitchen door all the way down to a low wooden fence at the foot of the slope. And beyond that fence the meadow began, and then the woods. In the middle of the garden, in a sunny patch I had been tending for almost 30 years, sat the vegetable beds. There were 6 of them, all framed in soft, weathered cedar boards, and they were the heart of everything I did out there. That summer, my daughter and her husband had to be away for 2 months for some work that took them out of the country. They asked if I would mind keeping the little one, and I told them honestly that I would be happier than I had been in a long time. They drove her up on a Sunday in early June with a duffel bag, a small purple suitcase, a stuffed gray rabbit, and a notebook with a sunflower on the cover. We hugged on the front walk, and my daughter cried a little, and my granddaughter only laughed and asked me whether the garden had any tomatoes yet, because she had been thinking about them on the drive. I told her the tomatoes were still small and green, but that they were coming, and she nodded very seriously, as if she had just received an important report. Then she took my hand and walked with me around to the back, and she stood very still in the middle of the lawn and looked at everything for a long moment. She told me the garden was bigger than she remembered, and I told her that gardens grow a little every year, in their own quiet way. In those first few days, we settled into a slow rhythm together. She would come down the stairs in the morning in her pajamas, sometimes carrying the gray rabbit by an ear, and I would already be at the kitchen table with my coffee and her glass of milk. We ate soft, scrambled eggs and toast with jam or oatmeal with brown sugar and apple, and we drank our drinks slowly. Then we would put on our gardening shoes, which were hers a small pair of green rubber boots with a yellow stripe, and mine my old brown clogs, and we would go out into the cool, early morning air. The garden in early morning was my favorite version of the garden. The dew was still on the leaves, and the light was soft and low, and the world had not yet warmed up enough to be loud. The birds were busy in the hedges, but in that small, busy way they are early on, before they settle into their long midday quiet. We would walk down the path together, and I would tell her what we were going to do that day, and she would listen with her head tilted to one side, the way she listens, as if she did not want to miss a single thing. The first week we focused on the tomatoes. There were 4 varieties in 2 of the beds, with little wooden labels at the end of each row. I taught her how to tie the soft green plants to their wooden stakes with strips of old T-shirt I had cut up the spring before. I showed her how to gently pinch off the small extra shoots that grow where 2 stems meet, so that the plant can put its strength into the fruit. She was very careful with all of this. She would frown a little and breathe through her nose, and her fingers were tiny and precise. By the end of the week, she could find the small extra shoots better than I could, because she was closer to the ground and her eyes were better. In the second week, the peas were ready, and we went out with 2 small wicker baskets and picked them together in the long morning shadow of the back fence. The pea vines had grown up over the trellis I had built in the spring, and they were full of fat green pods and small white flowers that smelled faintly sweet when you brushed against them. I showed her how to follow a vine from the bottom up, and how to feel a pod between her thumb and forefinger to know if it was full enough. We picked for almost an hour and filled both baskets. Then we sat on the back step with the baskets between us and shelled the peas into a big white bowl. The peas made a soft little tap-tap sound as they fell. We ate a few raw from the pods as we worked, because she said they tasted like green sugar, and I had to agree. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and the garden was too hot to be in, we would come inside and do quiet things. We made lemonade with the lemons I kept in the bowl on the counter, and we would set up the little jug and 2 glasses on the kitchen table and sit by the open window. We read books together on the cool couch in the front room. She liked a long old book about a girl who lived on a farm, and I would read a chapter aloud each afternoon, very slowly. And she would lie with her head on a cushion and the gray rabbit under her arm, and her eyes would go half closed before the end. Sometimes she fell asleep on me before the chapter was done, and I would let her sleep, and I would just keep my place in the book with one finger and look out the window at the meadow until she stirred. In the same week, we also gave a slow morning to the herb bed by the kitchen door. It was a small raised bed full of soft mounds of thyme and oregano, 2 big bushes of rosemary, a stand of mint that wanted to take over everything, and a row of basil I had started from seed in the spring. She helped me thin the basil, which meant picking out the smaller seedlings so the bigger ones had room to grow. We saved the tiny ones in a little glass bowl of water on the windowsill, and we used them on top of our scrambled eggs the next 2 mornings. She liked the smell of the rosemary the best. She would brush her hand along the top of the bush, then bring her fingers up to her nose and stand there with her eyes closed for a few seconds. I told her that was how my own grandmother had taught me to do it more than 60 years ago, and that some things are too good to ever change. She nodded and brushed the rosemary again, and tucked the smell into her hand and carried it back to the house. By the 3rd week, the strawberries were ripe. The strawberry bed was small and tucked under the kitchen window, and it had been giving me a few handfuls a week for years. That summer, it gave us bowlfuls. We would go out in the cool of the early evening, when the sun was low and the heat had eased, and we would crouch down at the edge of the bed and lift the soft green leaves and find the deep red berries hiding underneath. She would put one in her basket and one in her mouth in slow alternation, and I never minded. We made strawberry jam one Saturday morning, the 2 of us in the kitchen with the windows open and the radio playing a soft old program from the next town. The kitchen filled with the smell of warm berries and sugar, and we filled a row of small glass jars with the jam and lined them up on the windowsill like little ruby lights. In the evenings, we usually sat on the back step together with a glass of cold water each and watched the day go down. The light in our valley always goes orange first, then a soft pink, then a deep blue that takes a long time to leave. The swallows would come out from under the eaves of the barn and dip across the lawn in long, lazy curves. The fireflies would begin to lift out of the meadow grass beyond the fence, very slowly at first, only 1 or 2 at a time, then more and more, until the whole low slope down toward the woods was full of small, slow green lights. She loved the fireflies. She would set her water down very carefully on the step and stand up and walk out into the lawn in her bare feet, and just stand there with her arms out a little, watching the lights move around her. One night she asked me if the fireflies were lonely. I said no, I thought the fireflies were always together, even when they were far apart from each other in the grass, because they were all making the same soft light at the same time of year, and so they always knew each other was there. She thought about that for a long time, with her hands folded behind her back. Then she said that she thought I was right, and she came back to the step, and we sat there together until the first stars came out. In the middle of July, there was a stretch of rain that lasted almost 5 days. The garden could not have been happier, and we could not have been busier inside. We baked a small loaf of bread with my grandmother's recipe, and we made pea soup from the last of the peas, and we sorted all the seed packets in the kitchen drawer and put them back in alphabetical order, which was something I had been meaning to do for 10 years and had simply never gotten around to. She drew pictures of the garden in her sunflower notebook, with little labels for each bed, and she drew the gray rabbit too, sitting in front of the trellis. The labels were spelled almost right, and the drawings were perfect. By the end of August, the tomatoes were finally heavy and red, and the first cooler night had come through. We picked the tomatoes one afternoon and laid them in a flat basket on the kitchen counter, where they made a small, still life under the window. We made sandwiches with thick slices of them on warm bread with a little salt and pepper, and we ate them out on the back step with our knees together, and she told me, with her mouth half full, that this was the best sandwich she had ever had in her life. I told her I thought it might be the best sandwich I had ever had too, and I meant it. The day her parents came back to pick her up was a warm, bright Saturday in early September. We had been up early in the garden one last time, picking a small bag of late peas to send home with her, and a few of the last strawberries, and a handful of tomatoes still warm from the vine. When the car came down the lane, she ran out to it, and there was a great deal of hugging on the gravel, and the gray rabbit was passed from one set of arms to another more than once. I gave my daughter the bag of vegetables and a jar of strawberry jam. I gave my granddaughter the sunflower notebook because I had written something on the last page for her to find later. After they drove away, I stood for a long time by the picket fence in the front yard, with one hand resting on the top board, looking at the empty lane. Then I went back around to the garden and stood at the foot of the strawberry bed and looked at it in the slow, soft afternoon light. The whole garden seemed bigger and quieter than it had all summer. I sat down on the back step in the patch of warm sun and put my hands on my knees, and I let myself feel very tired and very lucky at the same time. The bees were still busy in the lavender by the fence, and a single swallow turned across the lawn, and far off in the meadow, a small wind moved through the grass. I closed my eyes and listened to all of it, and I let the summer settle around my shoulders like a soft, warm coat, and I did not move for a long time. The next story is about a few quiet days I spent at an old lighthouse on a long, flat headland, helping a friend who looked after the place for the summer season. The lighthouse sat at the very end of a low strip of land that reached out into a wide, calm bay. It had been built more than 100 years ago out of pale gray stone, with a small white cottage attached at its base and a low garden wall around them both. The tower itself was not very tall, maybe 50 feet from foot to lamp. But because the headland was so flat and so empty, the lighthouse felt taller from a distance than it really was, the way a single tree looks tall when it stands alone in the middle of a wide field. My friend had taken on the place for a season as a kind of working holiday. The light was automatic now. It did not need a keeper the way the old keepers were needed. But the cottage and the garden and the grounds still needed someone to live in them through the warm months, to keep things tidy and welcome the few visitors who came out along the headland path. He had asked me, weeks before, if I might come and stay for a few days in the middle of August, and I had said yes without thinking about it twice. I needed a quiet pocket in the year, and a lighthouse on an empty headland sounded like the most quiet pocket I could imagine. I drove out on a Tuesday afternoon. The road to the headland was a single lane that ran along low fields full of long pale grass and small tough wildflowers. The sea was on my left the whole way, and it was the soft blue color it gets in late summer when there is no wind. I rolled the window down and let the warm salt air come in, and I listened to the small, steady sound of the tires on the road, and I felt my shoulders come down a little for every mile I drove. The last half mile was on a rough gravel track that ended in a small, grassy parking spot beside the cottage. My friend was already at the door when I pulled up, with a tea towel over one shoulder and a wave for me as I got out. The cottage was very simple inside. A flagstone floor, a small kitchen with a wooden table, 2 bedrooms off a short hall, and a sitting room with 2 old armchairs and a small black iron stove that we did not need at all in August. The windows were small and deep, the kind that are set into thick stone walls, and each window had a little curtain in a soft blue check. He showed me my room, and I set down my one bag, and we went out the back door of the kitchen and walked along the low garden wall to the tower. The tower was reached through a green wooden door at its base. Inside, a narrow iron staircase wound up the curve of the wall, with small landings every so often where you could pause and look out a little window at the bay. At the top, behind a heavy door, was the lamp room, with a round wall of glass and a calm white drum of a light in the middle, and a thin metal walkway running around the outside of the glass. We climbed up together that first afternoon slowly and stepped out onto the walkway. From up there, the headland looked even smaller than it had from the car, a narrow finger of pale grass reaching out into the wide blue. The bay curled gently away from us, and the line of the far shore was a soft gray smudge at the edge of the world. A few small boats lay at rest in the distance, not moving much, just hanging on the water like leaves on a pond. We did not talk a great deal up there. We just stood with our hands on the metal rail and watched. The wind on the walkway was very gentle, the warm, low kind that does not push or pull, only moves your hair a little and reminds you that you are outside. After a while, my friend asked if I would like to walk back down for tea, and I told him I thought I would stay up there a few more minutes. He smiled and went down, and I leaned my elbows on the rail and watched a single white seabird drift along the edge of the cliff below me without ever needing to flap its wings. We settled into a slow rhythm during my stay. In the mornings, I would wake to the sound of gulls on the roof of the cottage and the small, soft hiss of the kettle in the kitchen. We would have toast and tea at the wooden table by the window, and we would look out at the day and decide what little thing we wanted to do with it. There was never much. Some weeding in the small kitchen garden by the back wall, a walk down the headland path to the cove where the tide pools were, a long, quiet hour with a book in the sitting room, a trip up to the lamp room to polish the brass around the door, and to check that everything looked tidy for any visitors who might come along. The visitors who did come were almost always pleasant, almost always a little surprised at how quiet the place felt. A young couple with a picnic basket came out on the second day and ate their lunch on the low wall, and they asked me very politely whether they could climb up to the lamp room, and I walked them up myself and answered their few questions about the light and the bay. They thanked me at the bottom of the stairs and walked back along the headland in the soft afternoon sun, and I watched them go for a long time, the way you watch slow strangers in a slow place. On the second day, we walked down the long path to the cove. The path ran along the spine of the headland and then dipped through a small, soft hollow before reaching the cliffs. Tall stalks of pale dry grass leaned over the edges of the path, and now and then a small brown bird would dart up out of them, fly a short distance, and drop back down again. The salt smell got stronger as we walked, and the small, steady sound of waves on stones rose up to meet us. At the cove, the path turned into a set of weathered wooden steps that took us down to a curved little beach of flat, smooth pebbles, and a few dark rocks tumbled along the edge of the water. The tide pools were on the far side of the beach, in a low shelf of stone that the sea had worn into a network of small, clear bowls. We walked over to them slowly, picking our way around tufts of bright green seaweed. We crouched at the edge of the largest pool, and after a few minutes of stillness, the small lives inside it began to show themselves. A pale crab, no bigger than a coin, moved sideways under a piece of weed. A small purple sea anemone slowly unfolded its soft fringe. A tiny silver fish flicked once and was gone. We did not say anything. We just watched, the way you can watch a small pool of moving water for a long time without ever feeling that anything is missing. We sat on a flat, dry rock at the edge of the beach for a while after that, with our shoes off and our feet in the cool, wet sand at the edge of the surf. A gull stood about 10 feet away with its head turned to one side, looking at us out of one yellow eye. The waves were the kind of waves that fold over very softly at the last second, almost without breaking. We stayed there until our shadows started to stretch. Then we put our shoes back on and walked slowly back up the path to the cottage. On the third evening, my friend baked bread. He had a small ceramic dish he had made the dough in early that morning, and by the late afternoon, it had risen into a soft, tall pillow at the top of the bowl. He turned it out onto the wooden table, and he kneaded it gently for a few minutes with the heels of his hands, and he shaped it into a round loaf and slid it into the small black oven of the stove in the kitchen. The cottage filled with the warm, sleepy smell of baking bread, the kind that reaches into every corner and softens everything. While the bread baked, we sat on the back step with 2 glasses of cold water and watched the bay turn the color of a peach. The wind dropped off entirely, the way it sometimes does at the end of a summer day, and the sea went so still you could see a single thin line of cloud reflected in it almost a mile out. When the bread came out of the oven, we let it cool on a wooden board on the table, and we cut into it with a long bread knife while it was still a little warm. He had made a small dish of butter mixed with garden herbs, and we ate slices of warm bread spread thick with the green butter, and we drank a little tea, and we did not say much at all. There is a kind of quiet that good company makes when neither person needs to fill it, and we were inside that kind of quiet that evening. After dinner, I climbed up the tower alone. The sun was almost down by then, and the sky on the seaward side was a long band of gold and pale rose. The light in the lamp room had begun its slow turning. It did not flash sharply the way some lights do. It rotated in a long, slow circle, and the soft white beam moved out across the bay in an unhurried way, like a finger sweeping a quiet line in sand. I stepped out onto the walkway and walked once around the tower, with the warm beam passing over me and then moving on. From up there, I could see the small lights of one fishing village at the very far end of the bay, blinking on one by one. I stood for a long time with my hands in my pockets and watched the day finish itself. When I came back down, the cottage was warm and yellow inside, and my friend had lit one small lamp in the sitting room. We read for a while in the 2 old armchairs, with our feet up on a little wooden footstool we shared, and we did not speak unless one of us needed to. When my book began to slide a little in my hand, he saw it and just smiled, and I closed the book gently and laid it on the side table, and I told him I thought I would head to bed. He said good night in his soft, low voice and went back to his page. My small room had a high, narrow bed with a soft white quilt and a window that looked out toward the sea. I left the curtain open. I lay down and pulled the quilt up to my chest and watched the room slowly go dark around me. The slow, steady beam of the lighthouse passed across the wall of the room every few seconds, very softly, in a way that did not wake me up, but only let me know where I was. The sound of the small, soft surf far below the headland came up through the window like a long, quiet breath. The kettle ticked once or twice as it cooled on the kitchen stove. Somewhere out on the headland, a single sheep made a small, comfortable sound, and then was quiet again. I lay there and watched the light cross the wall and counted 3 slow passes of it, and somewhere on the 4th I drifted off into a sleep so deep and so easy that I have remembered it ever since. In the morning, the gulls were back on the roof, and the kettle was back on the stove, and the bay was back outside the window in its soft, new blue. I dressed slowly and went out to the kitchen, and my friend was already at the table with a slice of last night's bread toasted in front of him. He nodded at me as I came in, and I nodded back, and I sat down at the table and let the new day begin in its own quiet time. And I knew already, before any of it had really started, that I would carry the feeling of this small old lighthouse with me for a long time after I had gone home. The last story for tonight is about a slow weekend I once spent at a small cabin by a lake, mending an old canoe and not doing very much of anything else. The cabin had been in my family for a long time. It was a 1-room wooden cabin with a tin roof and a small screened porch, sitting up on a low shelf of rock above a long, narrow lake. There was no road right to the cabin. You had to leave your car at a turnout half a mile back and walk in along a soft pine needle path through the trees. The path crossed a little plank bridge over a small stream and then opened into a clearing. And then the cabin appeared, with its small porch and its low brown chimney and a single old wooden dock running out into the water. I had not been up to the cabin in 2 years. Life had been busy, in the gentle ordinary way life gets busy when you are middle-aged, and the cabin had been sitting quietly without me for all that time. A neighbor on the next lake had been kind enough to check on it now and then. He had sent me a note in the spring to say that the cabin itself was fine, but the old canoe under the porch was looking very tired. He thought one good weekend of work might bring it back to life. I had told him I would come up in the early fall, and now the early fall had arrived, and I was on the path with my pack on my back, going down through the cool pines toward the lake. The clearing came into view about 10 minutes in. The cabin looked the way I remembered it, a little browner from another year of weather, but still solid and quiet. The porch screens were intact. The chimney was upright. The dock looked a little gray, but the boards seemed sound. A small breath of wind moved through the pines as I crossed the clearing, and a single leaf, already turning yellow, drifted down from somewhere and landed on the path in front of me. I went up the wooden steps of the porch, unlocked the door, and stood for a moment in the doorway. The cabin smelled of pine wood and a little of old wool blankets and a faint hint of dust. The light inside was soft and brown. There was a small wooden table by the window with 2 chairs, a low bed against the back wall with a folded gray quilt at the foot of it, a small wood stove in the corner, and a bookshelf of paperbacks and old field guides above the bed. I set my pack down by the table and opened both of the small windows and the door wide, and the slow lake air moved through the cabin for the first time in a while. The old canoe was under the porch on a pair of wooden sawhorses, upside down. It was a long red cedar canoe my grandfather had built more than 50 years ago, with cane seats and a thwart of varnished oak in the middle. I had grown up paddling it on the lake. My father had taught me to paddle in the bow of it when I was 7, and I had taught my own children in the same bow when they had been small. The paint on the hull was tired now, and there were 2 patches in the canvas where small splits had begun, and one of the inner ribs had a small clean crack that needed a new piece of wood. I had brought a few things in my pack. A small folding kit of cane, some new canvas, a tin of marine paint in the same deep red, a couple of new ribs already cut and shaped at a friend's workshop, a small pot of varnish, a couple of brushes, sandpaper of 3 different grades, and a thermos of coffee. I unpacked everything onto the porch and laid it out in a tidy line along the front of the bench, and I stood there for a moment just looking at it all, the way you look at the day's work before you begin it. That first afternoon, I did not start on the canoe right away. I made the cabin ready first. I shook out the gray quilt and hung it over the porch rail to air. I wiped down the table and the chairs with a damp cloth. I swept the floor with the small broom that lived behind the door. I built a small fire in the stove just to take the slight chill out of the air, even though the day was warm enough. I made a pot of coffee on the stove top and poured myself a mug and walked out onto the dock, slowly, board by board, testing each one with my foot. They were all sound. I sat down on the end of the dock with my mug between my hands and looked out at the lake for a long time. The lake was very calm. It ran for almost a mile to the north and another half-mile to the south, and it was narrow enough that you could see the trees on the far shore clearly. A pair of loons were drifting near the middle of the lake, very far apart from each other, doing nothing in particular. Every once in a while one of them would make that long, soft call that loons make in the evening, the slow, rising note that fills the whole valley without ever feeling loud. The other one would answer after a few moments, very gently, and the calls would carry across the water and then settle back into it. I drank my coffee and let the late afternoon move along around me. After my coffee, I sat on the dock for a long while, watching the water. The lake had a pattern of small, slow ripples on it that I had forgotten about until I saw them again. The pattern would shift very gently, and then settle, and then shift again. I watched a leaf drift down the lake along a slow current I could not see. I watched a small water bug skate across the surface in a series of short, clean dashes. A fish rose somewhere out in the middle and made a single soft ring that widened and faded. I felt my shoulders settle down even further, into a place they had not been in a long time. The next morning, I started on the canoe. I rolled it carefully off the sawhorses and laid it right side up on a soft blanket on the porch floor, and I started by sanding the hull. The work went slowly, in the good slow way. I sat on a low stool, the sandpaper soft in my hand, and I worked along the side of the hull in long, even strokes. The wood under the old paint began to show through in pale, warm places, and I let it. I sanded along one side and then the other, and after a while my back was a little stiff and my fingers had the soft, pleasant ache of careful work. I stopped for a stretch and a long drink of water, and I stood on the dock and watched the loons again. In the middle of the day, I sat on the porch step in the patch of warm sun and ate a small lunch. I had brought a wedge of cheese, a few crackers, and a hard pear from the market in town. I ate slowly, watching the lake change color very gently as a small bank of high cloud drifted overhead. While I was sitting there, a chickadee came down out of the pines and landed on the railing at the far end of the porch. He looked at me with his bright black eye, hopped twice along the railing, looked at me again, and then flew off across the clearing. A few minutes later, another one came, or maybe the same one, and did the same small visit. I sat very still both times, and I thought how nice it was to share the porch for a few seconds with a small wild creature who was not afraid of me, but did not need anything from me either. In the afternoon, I cut the small clean crack out of the broken inner rib and fitted in one of the new pieces I had brought up. The new wood was paler than the old wood, but I knew it would weather in time. I tapped the small new rib into place with a soft wooden mallet, gently, listening for the small change in sound that tells you it has settled. Then I set the patches into the canvas where the splits were, with a careful hand and a slow brush, and I left them to dry on the porch. In the evening, I sat on the dock with a sandwich and a thermos of soup, and I watched the lake turn from its bright afternoon blue into a softer evening color. The loons came in toward this end of the lake as the light went down, and I could see them more clearly now, dipping their heads into the water, lifting them again, drifting on. A small breeze moved across the water and made a thin, gentle pattern on the surface, and then it was gone, and the lake was glass again. A red squirrel scolded me from a tall pine somewhere behind the cabin, very lightly, more as a conversation opener than a complaint. I slept that night in the small bed with two of the wool blankets pulled up under my chin, and I left one of the windows open a little. The cabin was very quiet. The fire in the stove had burned down to a soft red glow that I could see through the small window in its door. The lake outside made no sound at all. Far off, a single owl called twice, very softly, and was quiet again. I lay there with the gray quilt over me and thought about my grandfather building the canoe in his shop almost 60 years ago, and about my father teaching me to read the wind on the water, and about how strange and warm it was to be there alone now, taking my own slow care of all of it. The next morning, I finished the canoe. I painted the hull in the deep red I had brought, working from one end to the other with the kind of careful brush strokes that took my whole attention. The new paint went on smooth and bright, and after I was done, the canoe looked younger than it had in years. I stepped back from it and just stood looking at it for a while, the way you look at something you have given a little of yourself to. While the paint dried, I walked the small loop trail behind the cabin, the one my grandfather had cleared a long time ago. The path was narrow and soft with old pine needles, and it wound through a quiet stand of birches and across a small mossy creek and around the back of a low rock outcrop with a view down to the lake. I walked it slowly, with my hands in my pockets, listening to my own footsteps and to the small sounds of the woods, and I came back to the cabin feeling rested in a way I had not felt in a long time. After I came back, I tidied up the porch. I picked up the soft balls of used sandpaper and put them in a small paper bag. I wiped the brushes clean with a rag and a little turpentine, and I set them in a glass jar by the door to dry. I folded the soft blanket the canoe had been resting on and laid it on the bench. The porch looked tidy again, the way I like a workspace to look when the work is almost done. I stood for a moment with my hands on my hips and just admired the quiet of the place. A jay called once from the woods behind the cabin, then it was quiet again. In the late afternoon, I put the canoe in the water for the first time. I lowered it gently from the dock, and the new red hull settled into the lake with a quiet, clean sound. I climbed in carefully, sat on the cane seat, picked up the wooden paddle from the dock, and pushed off. The canoe slid out across the calm water the way it had always slid, low and quiet and easy. I paddled out into the middle of the lake without hurrying, and I let the bow turn slowly to the north. The loons watched me from a distance without minding. The light was going golden on the far shore. I paddled for almost an hour, very gently, in long, unhurried strokes, and then I rested the paddle across my knees and just drifted for a while in the middle of the lake, with the sound of small water moving along the side of the canoe. I came back to the dock as the last light left the water. I tied the canoe up carefully, ran my hand once along the new red paint, and went up to the cabin. I made one more pot of coffee on the stove, and I sat on the porch step with the warm mug in my hands and watched the stars begin to come out over the lake, one by one, very slowly, with no hurry at all. The loons called once more, far down at the south end of the lake. A small fish jumped somewhere out in the middle. I sat there until the sky was full of stars and the cool was creeping into the porch boards, and then I went inside, and I closed the door very softly behind me, and I went to bed feeling lighter than I had felt in a long time.